Warren Buffett is, by almost any measure, the most famous, frugal billionaire alive. He still lives in the house he bought in 1958 for $31,500. He drives himself to McDonald's for breakfast. He has, at various points in his life, been the wealthiest person on earth while keeping his personal spending at a level most middle-class professionals would recognize. So it might surprise you to learn that Buffett has been saying the same thing for decades, in speeches, in annual letters, in interviews, in quiet conversations with young investors who come to him for advice. He has been saying that there are specific things you should never be cheap on, that there are categories of life and work where cutting costs is not discipline. It is self-destruction. He is not contradicting himself. He is making a distinction that most people never fully grasp. The distinction between cheapness that builds wealth and cheapness that silently dismantles it. Here are the 10 things Warren Buffett says you need to stop being cheap on. The first is yourself. Buffett has called investing in yourself the single best investment any person can make. Not stocks, not real estate, not even Berkshire Hathaway. Yourself. He makes this point specifically and consistently, and it is worth understanding why. Every other asset you own can be taxed, inflated, devalued, lost in a divorce, or destroyed in a market crash. The knowledge, skills, and capabilities you build inside yourself cannot be taken from you. They compound quietly year after year in ways that never appear on a balance sheet, but that determine the ceiling on everything else you do. Buffett spent years as a young man studying under Benjamin Graham. He paid to attend Dale Carnegie's public speaking course, not because he needed to speak well for social reasons, but because he had calculated that his ability to communicate ideas clearly was the bottleneck on everything he wanted to build. He invested in removing that bottleneck. The certificate from that course is, he has said, one of the most important things hanging in his office. The person who cuts corners on their own development because a course costs too much, a book costs too much, a coach costs too much, is making the most expensive mistake in personal finance. They are saving a small number by capping a large one. The second is your health. Buffett has a specific metaphor he returns to when he talks about health, and it is worth hearing directly. He tells young people to imagine that at 16 years old, a genie appeared and offered them any car they wanted, any car in the world, free of charge. There is one condition. It is the only car they will ever own for the rest of their life. What would you do with that car? You would read the manual carefully. You would change the oil on schedule. You would park it carefully. You would never let it sit in the rain without protection. You would treat it with extraordinary care because you knew there was no replacement coming. Buffett then points out that you received exactly this deal at birth. You received one body, one mind, one set of organs that, if you are lucky, you will run for 80 or 90 years with no opportunity to trade in or upgrade. The cheapness that shows up in health decisions, skipping preventive appointments because they cost money, ignoring symptoms because dealing with them is inconvenient, cutting corners on sleep, on nutrition, on mental well-being, is cheapness applied to the only asset that runs every other asset you will ever own. The cost of neglecting it does not show up immediately. It accumulates slowly over decades and presents the bill at the worst possible time. The third is professional counsel. Charlie Munger, Buffett's partner and one of the sharpest legal minds in business history, spent decades warning people about the cost of cheap legal and financial advice. His version of it was typically direct. He said that the man who represents himself in a legal matter has a fool for a client, and that the person who hires the cheapest available professional to protect their financial life is making the same error. The reasoning is simple. Complex legal and financial problems have asymmetric outcomes. The difference between a well-structured arrangement and a poorly structured one is not marginal. It is often the entire difference between retaining something and losing it, between paying what you owe and paying multiples of what you owe, between a business that transfers cleanly to the next generation and one that dissolves in a dispute. Buffett himself has spent enormous sums on the best available legal, tax, and financial expertise throughout his career. Not because he could not figure things out himself, because he understood that the cost of great counsel is a fraction of the cost of a single avoidable mistake. The brilliant attorney who charges $300 an hour is almost always cheaper than the adequate one who charges $100 once you account for the outcomes over time. The fourth is the people around you. Buffett says that the most important decision a person makes is not which stock to buy, or which business to enter, or which city to live in. It is who they choose to spend their time with. He is describing, in personal terms, a principle that governs everything he has built professionally as well. He has written and spoken at length about the difference in outcome between working with people you completely trust and admire versus people who are merely adequate. He describes seeking out people who are smarter than him in specific domains, people whose integrity he does not need to question, people who raise the level of his own thinking just by being in the room. And he has been willing to pay fully for those people, to structure arrangements that attract and retain them, to never let cost become the reason he settled for less than the best available person in a role that mattered. The inverse is equally clear in his thinking. Cheap partnerships, cheap hires, cheap associations, the ones you enter because the price was right rather than because the person was right, carry hidden costs that the initial savings cannot cover. They produce mediocre outcomes on work that deserved better. They consume your time and energy managing deficiencies you could have avoided. They expose you to risks that capable people would have prevented. The person who makes hiring decisions based on salary minimization is optimizing for the wrong number. The fifth is your reputation. Buffett has one of the most quoted lines in business on this subject. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you will do things differently. What fewer people discuss is the corollary. Protecting your reputation requires active investment, not passive good behavior, active spending of time, attention, relationships, and sometimes money on maintaining the standards that a good reputation requires. This shows up in small ways and large ones. The business owner who cuts a corner on quality to save money on a single order and loses a relationship worth years of revenue. The professional who handles a difficult situation cheaply without the care the moment required and discovers that the story travels. The person who was technically honest but chose the lowest cost version of honesty, the version that left the other party with an impression that was not fully accurate, and finds that the gap between what was said and what was understood becomes the most expensive miscommunication of their career. Buffett runs Berkshire Hathaway with a set of standards that cost more to maintain than a more relaxed approach would. He accepts that cost without complaint, because he understands that the reputation of Berkshire is itself one of the most valuable assets the company owns, and that no quarterly saving is worth a fraction of what that reputation is worth over time. The sixth is your mentors. When Buffett was a young man, he read a book called The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. He later described it as the best book on investing ever written. He then drove to New York, enrolled in Graham's class at Columbia Business School, and eventually went to work for Graham directly at a salary that was modest by any standard. He was not there for the money. He was there because he had identified the best available mind in his field and had calculated that access to that mind was worth more than any alternative use of the same years. He paid for that access in time, in effort, in foregone income, and in the specific discomfort of being a student when he was already capable of performing at a high level. Most people resist this investment because it is hard to see on a spreadsheet. You cannot calculate the return on a mentor relationship the way you can calculate the return on a bond, but Buffett's career is itself the evidence. The compression of learning, the avoidance of mistakes that would have cost years, the acceleration of credibility that came from genuine association with a great mind. These are returns that no other investment vehicle could have produced in the same time frame. The person who is unwilling to pay the price of access to the best teachers available in their field is saving a small cost by forfeiting an enormous one. The seventh is your primary relationship. This one Buffett discusses less publicly, but it runs through everything he has said about the conditions that enabled his work. He has described the importance of being with a partner who supports your direction, who is genuinely interested in what you are doing, who creates an environment in which you can function at full capacity rather than one in which your energy is divided and depleted by conflict or misalignment. The investment this requires is not purely financial. It is investment of attention, of care, of the time required to build and maintain a relationship that genuinely works. And the cost of being cheap on that investment, of not showing up, of not being present, of treating the relationship as something that maintains itself, is measured not in dollars, but in the quality of every year that follows. Buffett has said that the most important factor in his success, the one he would replicate above all others if he could go back, is the quality of the people he chose to build his life around. He does not mean this in a vague motivational sense. He means it as a precise claim about the conditions that made his work possible. A life built with the right person, fully invested in, is a compounding asset of a kind that no portfolio can replicate. The eighth is your sleep. This one Buffett is direct about in a way that catches people off guard. He sleeps 8 hours. He protects that number. He structures his schedule around it. When people try to fill his calendar with early morning commitments that would require him to function on less, he declines. The research on sleep and cognitive performance is unambiguous and has been for decades. Sleep deprivation measurably degrades decision-making, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and the ability to recognize and evaluate complex patterns. These are not marginal effects. They are significant, reproducible, and cumulative. Chronic poor sleep does not just make you tired, it makes you measurably less capable at the exact skills that generate value in knowledge work. Buffett makes decisions for a living. The quality of those decisions over a 70-year career is the entirety of what he produces. Protecting the biological conditions that enable high-quality decisions is not a luxury. It is professional maintenance of his primary instrument. The person who sacrifices sleep to work more is trading the quality of every decision they make for a larger number of lower-quality decisions. The math, examined carefully, almost never works in their favor. The ninth is experiences that change how you see the world. Buffett has read approximately 500 to 600 pages every day for most of his adult life. He has spent decades in conversation with some of the most interesting minds of his era. He traveled to meet the people he admired, not because travel was cheap or convenient, but because he understood that certain kinds of knowledge transfer only in person over time, in real environments. The distinction he draws implicitly is between experiences that entertain and experiences that expand. The first category is comfortable and forgettable. The second is uncomfortable and permanent. It changes the vocabulary of your thinking. It installs reference points that you will use for the rest of your life. The person who skips the trip, the class, the conversation, the event, because the cost seems high, is, in many cases, skipping an experience that would have altered something important in how they see the world. They are preserving money by forfeiting understanding. An understanding, in the long arc of a career, is worth more than almost any financial instrument you could have bought with the same money. The 10th is the quality of your work. Buffett has spent his career studying businesses, and one of the clearest patterns he has identified is the long-term advantage of companies that never compromise on the quality of what they deliver. Not because quality is a moral position, because quality is a compounding asset. Every customer who receives something genuinely excellent becomes a source of future business, future referrals, future reputation that expands without additional marketing cost. The inverse is equally clear. The business or the individual that cuts corners on the quality of their output to save money in the short term is borrowing against a reputation they are simultaneously depleting. The savings are real and immediate. The costs are real and delayed. And the gap between when you receive the benefit and when you pay the price is wide enough that most people never connect them clearly. Buffett has never run a business that competed primarily on price. He has, consistently and deliberately, sought businesses that competed on the quality and reliability of what they produced. The cost of maintaining that standard was always, in his analysis, lower than the cost of losing the reputation it created. There is a version of frugality that is the foundation of wealth, and there is a version of cheapness that quietly destroys it. The difference is not always obvious in the moment. The cheap decision often feels responsible, careful, conservative. The expensive decision often feels extravagant before the return materializes. Buffett has spent a long career making this distinction in how he runs his businesses, in how he structures his days, in the advice he gives to people who ask him what he would do differently if he were starting over. The answer is consistent. He would invest more in himself, more in his health, more in the people around him, more in the quality of his work, and more in the experiences that expand how he sees the world. The frugality he practices on cars and houses is not an end in itself. It is the means of generating capital that can be deployed in these directions. The point was never to spend as little as possible. The point was to spend carefully, strategically, and generously, where generosity compounds. That is the version of financial intelligence that most people never reach. Not because it is complicated, but because it requires a longer view than most people are willing to hold. Hold the longer view.